Hi, everyone. Thank you for waiting patiently for a couple people to get started and jump on. So this is the first in a four-part series on vulnerability management. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for taking the time either right before lunch or early in the afternoon today to sit here and be part of this discussion. You'll note that we are going to hold questions until the end, but we have dedicated a bit of time to cover that. So if there's anything that comes up over the course of this webinar, please feel free to pop that into the chat, and we'll definitely spend some time at the end to review. I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about the purpose of this webinar and some of the conversations that we've had with our partners at Tenable about this. So this webinar series is intended to focus more on the fundamentals of why vulnerability management is important and help to address some of the questions that your stakeholders, your partners, your customers, your senior leadership will ask as it relates to an organization's security posture and where vulnerability management plays a part in that. So thank you to Tenable for their partnership on this series. So just to get started to think about this conversation, wanted to take a second to address the types of concepts that not only you folks, but those who are one step removed from vulnerability management, what that means to them. And there have been certainly, vulnerability management fits into that part of security development that is a bit more of the eat your vegetables part of security historically. And so there has been a bit of a reputation for this process that vulnerability management can be challenging and that it is one of those things that an organization needs to do fundamentally, but when it's done in a vacuum, and it's something that we'll cover throughout this topic, that it is difficult to speak to the value of it individually. So you can imagine some of the questions that others in your organizations have when another list of patches comes in on Tuesdays, what that feels like. The challenges when another organization deals with a breach scenario when senior leadership are asked these questions about information about how vulnerable they were ahead of time, the challenges from that. And honestly, just the interplay between identifying vulnerabilities in your environment and actually remediating them and how that affects business processes. All these things are incredibly important for this process to be done effectively in an organization. And we'd like to address some of the reasons why we feel that this is important going forward. So fundamentally, this initial webinar episode is going to cover a couple of common questions and a way to think about this to ensure that vulnerability management as a process, as a core part of your security practice is going to help you better enable those critical business functions for your organization. And so right off the bat, looking at the initial question that many get asked, and it was one of the core points of introducing this webinar, is when that publicly identified event happens, whether it's a breach scenario, whether it's one of those public disclosures of a major malware campaign or a popular vulnerability that comes out, getting those questions about, as an organization, are we prepared? And following that, are we at risk? What is the potential of this bad thing, this vulnerability, this breach scenario? What could that happen to our organization? And then the next question comes, well, what are we going to do about that? What resources do we have available? What is our plan? And then ultimately, for others in our space, for others having these same problems, how is that working for them? What challenges do they face? What lessons can we learn from that? A little bit about me before we get started. I'm a cybersecurity advisor. I represent our risk advisory services practice in Western Canada, where I lead discussions around our risk advisory services, which include governance, risk, and compliance consulting, our offensive security efforts around pen testing, red teaming, as well as our vulnerability management services. I'm one of two Tenable guardians here in Canada, and my perspective for information security is perhaps a little bit different than some of the others that I work with. I came to cybersecurity as a component of other security conversations. So my initial exposure to security as an intern, and then my first role out of college was as part of a strategic security consulting practice. And so cybersecurity was one component of that, but what this allowed me to do is really get a good understanding of how threat modeling works in organizational environments and understand the importance of actionable intelligence to drive those decisions. And that tends to be the way that I think about security, and that's part of the reason why I think vulnerability management is such a crucial part of that process. When I'm not here talking about security with CDW's customers, you can find me playing soccer, making and sharing good food in the kitchen, and spending time with my wife, my 2 little boys, and my bulldog Hank. Let's get back to this question of, are we prepared? And I think this is an important point as this question is becoming more and more regular, to think about how this can and should lead to a change in mindset for security practices. So let's break down what this question actually is asking. So when this question is pointed from an engaged stakeholder, whether it's a partner, a customer, a member of your senior leadership team, really what that question is asking is, what is that potential exposure to our business? What information do we understand about this circumstance, and what is the potential impact of this in our environment? And that "are you prepared" question can be difficult to answer if you don't have a clear understanding of the scope of the potential problem. And this is one of the initial areas where vulnerability management is important, because what it does is it gives you a good handle on what assets are under your control to be able to determine what the potential challenge could be when you're faced with answering this question. Because it is an assessment of risk-based performance. Being able to demonstrate how vulnerable we may be to a problem, to understand that you really need to understand, as I mentioned, which assets may be involved in this, and what the potential severity and likelihood of that problem happening in the environment, to not only answer this question, but be armed with the plan, the action points to be able to actually remediate this in the environment. So the 2 core areas of focus to be able to answer this question as it relates to these vulnerabilities are, on one hand, our assets in your environment, and a measure of how critical they are to the business to be able to understand the potential business impact. And also, when looking at the vulnerability itself, looking at the severity and the likelihood to be able to properly calculate risk. But really, that only tells you, are we prepared for addressing this challenge? What that doesn't necessarily tell you is how effective those controls are in your environment to not only remediate that potential impact, be able to demonstrate that over time and improve that process. One of the challenges here is that although many of the questions that come from these stakeholders to the security practice, the most publicized challenges tend to come from these higher profile circumstances that may not be the primary focus for many security practices. So hearing about side channel processor attacks or APT campaigns are certainly scary, and they're challenges that organizations do have to face. But honestly, most commonly, the compromises that we see with the Canadian organizations that we work with many times come from vulnerabilities that are commonplace, that are not recent, that there has been information about them available online for a while, and that they have been ignored due to some kind of oversight or misprioritization, or perhaps a misconfiguration in how the organization addresses those risks. So although it is definitely important to have a plan in place to address those emerging vulnerabilities that may be incredibly problematic, part of this is helping establish that baseline and ensure that those simpler risks are addressed as well to shore up that security practice. So let's take a minute to talk about the asset side of this conversation. Because as we discussed, being able to understand the assets that may be in scope to answer this "are we prepared" question is really a conversation about an organization's exposure. And I think an important part to understand about assets and exposure is what it is that vulnerability scanning tools actually accomplish. So certainly these are very important tools for defenders of an organization to understand the assets that they have, that they're responsible for, how they're configured, what they're able to speak to, and some of the potential vulnerabilities that exist there. But fundamentally, these tools are also used by malicious actors or those that play malicious actors, like an offensive security practice, like our own penetration testing team. And the purpose of leveraging these tools in an environment, whether you're doing it from a white hat perspective or a black hat perspective, really the outcomes are the same. You're enabling the ability to discover hosts in an environment and classify them properly, being able to understand the different types of assets that are available in the environment, determining the services that exist on them that are running, and the processes that are running as well. Once that's done, being able to understand the possibility of vulnerabilities in the environment, to consolidate them and understand and assess how they could be leveraged in a potential attack is something that honestly both the defenders of your organization and a potential attacker are going to do. And the reason why in both of these circumstances is to better understand an organization's attack surface, whether you're talking about an external network or an internal network or an application that's in scope. Being able to have a detailed understanding of what that surface looks like can help to prioritize as a defender what it is that you need to harden to prevent this capability on the attacker side. Unfortunately, as these capabilities continue to progress with those services that criminal groups are leveraging, their capability to understand this about an organization's external environment is becoming easier and easier as these tools are now starting to include automation and orchestration capabilities, and the breadth of information they have about environments is continuing to grow. And want to spend a little bit of time to discuss some of the tools that are available to potential attackers to get an idea of what that parity of information looks like, and part of the reason why conducting vulnerability management as a core facet of your security practice is so important. And so for those of you who may not be aware, there are services that are freely available on the internet that can provide some of the fundamental information that a vulnerability scanning tool can, that are freely available for anybody to look at. And one of the best examples of this is a website called Shodan.io. So Shodan describes itself as a search engine for internet-connected devices. And I have a screenshot here of an example search that anybody on the internet can pull. So in this particular case, this is from about a week ago, this report is showing about 200,000 FTP servers around the world and details about them where authentication has been disabled. So effectively what this means is that for a bad actor who's looking to leverage an attack to steal files or use that to get into an organization's environment, they can use a search engine like this to be able to determine who is potentially affected by it and then start to build that campaign. So not only is this service able to understand assets that are exposed on the internet, but also some of the services that are running in the ports that are open as well. So it's taking that first step to provide an understanding of an attack or of a potential victim's environment, and then allowing that potential attacker to spend less time going through the enumeration process to figure out what a good next step is for them. So understanding this having at least this level of visibility of the assets in your environment that are exposed, the services that are running, and ensure that the plan that you have takes those things into account is so important, especially when potentially dealing with an attacker who is motivated to target your environment. So on one hand, we talk about assets and the potential exposure to the business, but that certainly is one piece of the puzzle. The other half of this is understanding that context of the size and breadth of the environment. Then it's important to understand the potential vulnerabilities that may exist on those assets and how to prioritize them and understand with business context where to focus an organization's attention. So to be able to appropriately make risk-based decisions about prioritizing security efforts in an organization, you really do have to have an understanding of that potential exposure in an environment. But that is difficult to do without having the appropriate business context about how a particular type of vulnerability can affect an environment. And so historically, and this is going back to the beginning of the discussion about how difficult prioritization historically has been with vulnerability management, especially for organizations that are leveraging something like an Excel document to be able to prioritize thousands upon thousands of vulnerabilities. And historically, there have been attempts to use scoring mechanisms like the CVSS score to determine the most severe vulnerabilities to spend the time and attention to focus on. But I'm going to break down a little bit some of the challenges that exist there with a particular example, and hopefully that can be a point to help understand where that focus needs to be. So speaking about vulnerabilities, I wanted to use Eternal Blue, also known as MS-17010, as an example here, to talk about how changes to a particular vulnerability should affect the way that an organization treats them, and give some context about how to process the potential future risk of a circumstance. So Eternal Blue started off as an NSA cyber weapon. It is an incredibly severe arbitrary code execution exploit, which effectively allows a user, if they can target one Microsoft machine in an environment, Windows machine, it allows them to pivot to others in the environment and eventually get administrative privileges. It's incredibly severe, which is why it was leveraged in a series of attacks. And so as of March 2017, this Microsoft understood that this exploit existed, and they had got advance notice, thankfully, that this had been stolen from the NSA by a group called Shadow Brokers and was going to be leaked. So the following month in April, that leak did happen, and within a month, this exploit, which frankly, when it first was announced, was relatively difficult to exploit by itself. It required very specific conditions, and everybody understood that it was potentially very serious, but only very skilled attackers like the NSA were able to effectively execute it consistently. But that's until it got integrated into the WannaCry ransomware campaign, which was absolutely devastating to organizations all the way around the world. And by the following February, this exploit also had published exploit code available for it on Metasploit. And so you're taking a very, very, very serious but quite difficult exploit to be able to execute from a proof of concept, which organizations were potentially concerned about, but didn't have the time to prioritize, into a working exploit that every penetration tester and criminal on the internet would have the ability to relatively trivially exploit an environment. So let's break down what the actual score is for this and why using this as a leverage point to determine prioritization environment can be so challenging. So Eternal Blue has a score of 8.1 on the CVSS 3 scoring metric. which is high, but it's not considered severe, which is where a lot of organizations unfortunately still have to spend all of their time focusing. And part of the reason for this is what I was just describing, where the initial attack complexity for this vulnerability was pretty difficult. It required very specific circumstances, and it didn't always work. And so the score remained high, in part because the CVSS score is a static value when it's discovered by a security researcher. It doesn't change over time. So as these changes that we discussed in terms of how it was leveraged morphed, this score stayed static. And so for organizations that relied on this, they were potentially blind to the changing risk of this vulnerability in their environment. So as I mentioned, because Microsoft also very quickly created a patch for this, that also reduced the potential impact and exploitability of this, because as far as researchers were concerned, if there's a patch that's applicable in the environment, then this vulnerability is potentially less severe than it would otherwise be. But the fact of the matter is, some organizations still rely on SMB, which is what the vulnerability exploited, or they haven't patched it in their environment. There may be certain assets that they couldn't for one reason or another. And so even though it is true that there's a patch out there and that it was initially difficult to exploit, that doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story, and that's part of the problem here. And so on one hand, you talk about the specific attributes of a vulnerability, but the other part of that is, how does this actually relate to our own business context? So in the case of Eternal Blue, an organization, it may be the case that they can deprioritize this vulnerability in their environment if they have certain controls in place. So if the organization, because fundamentally, as it relates to WannaCry, this allows that exploit to be effective. But if you have good controls around ransomware protection, and that is the core concern that you have as it relates to Eternal Blue, then maybe this is less of a challenge in your environment than it would otherwise be, but you need to have that business context to make that appropriate decision. And for the most part, I will say that this vulnerability continues to remain a substantial threat to businesses where they haven't had the opportunity to patch it yet. And so understanding that business context is certainly critical to making these decisions, especially at scale. So let's look at a couple examples of some high-profile breaches here to talk about how some other organizations have addressed vulnerabilities and some of the challenges that have come from that. So here's a quick snapshot of some recent breaches. The blog Information is Beautiful, I think, does a pretty great job of this. And if you actually navigate to that website, each one of these has a breakdown of the actual breach and some useful information. So I definitely recommend checking it out. But just looking at this chart for a second, understanding the sheer volume of data that now is available on the internet as a result of these services being breached is pretty mind-breaking. But on the same hand, for most, if not a vast majority of these breaches, we really don't have a clear understanding of what happened. Organizations have to disclose that a breach happened, but they don't have to say necessarily what vulnerability was exploited or what the particular circumstances are. So actually finding this information to share can be challenging. But I think these couple of examples are going to be pretty helpful to talk through some of the pitfalls that many organizations face. And no story on vulnerability management and some of the challenges that organizations face is complete without talking about Equifax. There is reams and reams and reams of reporting on this subject, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel. But one of the things that I think is valuable to point out about Equifax that was not as closely covered by many organizations as I think it deserved to be, is the fact that Equifax actually had a pretty sophisticated cybersecurity platform. They employed a lot of people in that practice, and they had a lot of really good tools in place. Unfortunately, for Equifax, in this particular circumstance, there was both a breakdown in prioritization and in reporting practices for vulnerability management, which ensured that even though the organization was informed about this breach and had taken steps to remediate it, they didn't have an effective way to confirm that that remediation effort had taken place. And in this particular case, there was a breakdown in communication, and this vulnerability slipped through the cracks. And so certainly a valuable part of this is to ensure that that this process aligns with the other aspects of remediation that are going to be important for an environment to be able to actually address the challenges that they find. Another prominent example from the subject is the MageCart campaign, which there were a number of disclosures over the summer of 2019 to address this, where tens of thousands of websites that do online commerce were affected by this. There were some very public examples, British Airways, Ticketmaster, Forbes, Newegg, but this campaign is incredibly widespread. It's quite a sophisticated group of criminal organizations that are working together to actually execute this, but the underlying vulnerability for all of these organizations is the reliance on a legacy version of the platform that they're using, where the vulnerabilities associated with this were discovered in 2015. And the exploit code that allows for remote code execution on this particular version of the platform that is pretty commonly leveraged and being targeted here has been available since August of 2015. So not only is it important to see the severity of a potential vulnerability in the environment, but understanding the age of a vulnerability in an environment is important as well. It not only addresses how likely it is that that vulnerability could be leveraged in an attack, but it also helps to fine-tune those prioritization efforts and understand why potentially it takes so long for an organization to address vulnerabilities that have been around for a number of years. And finally, and in this particular case, we have less information about the vulnerability itself, but Google ended up having to shut down Google Plus in advance of when they expected to do so because of a repetition of vulnerabilities that they disclosed in their environment. And so what I wanted to take away from this particular example is that although the circumstances between these two disclosures were a little bit different, they were both looking at similar problems with their data. And so when the first vulnerability was disclosed, where 500,000 user accounts had potentially exposed private information about them through their API, what that could have leveraged, and hopefully is a lesson that organizations will take from this, is that the theme from this and the potential for other similar problems that the organization could face is something that wasn't addressed quickly enough to prevent the second disclosure from having to be made. And in that case, we're talking 52.5 million accounts that were exposed. And so looking at these examples and talking about assets and vulnerabilities in an environment, what I hope that you're going to take from this as a start for the next couple webinar episodes that we're going to discuss is the value of embedding vulnerability management in an organizational security posture as one of those sources of intelligence. Because pulling that asset information and pulling detailed vulnerability information in by itself is what that historic challenge has been, because doing so in a vacuum, it causes frustration with other aspects of the business, with understanding how it integrates with other security tools, with the potential impact of patching these vulnerabilities or remediating them in other ways. But being able to leverage this in line with some of those other practices and use this to inform some of the other questions that your other business units, your other parts of your security practice need to do is so important. And so taking a step back from those previous examples, being able to fully close that feedback loop by integrating vulnerability management into larger change management and IT operations practices is so important, because being able to check that those things have been done and confirm when there's actual problems that may occur. To be able to improve that process over time is so important to ensure that the risk tolerance that you expect and the risk exposure that your organization is facing is as closely aligned as possible. Having a clear understanding of the assets that are in scope and their potential exposure to vulnerabilities is fundamental to have that comprehensive strategy for security in your environment. And doing so allows you to spot those thematic risks through analytics and through these collaborative processes where you integrate vulnerability management into some of the other efforts, whether it's change control and IT operations, as we already talked about, whether it's software development practices, whether it is determinations on investment for assets in your environment. Having that context of what an organization is responsible for is so important. And ideally, when this is structured in a way that it is available for other parts of the business to access, where it is enriching other data that other parts of your security team need to be able to do their jobs at the moment that they need it, can allow vulnerability management data to act as a force multiplier for those other capabilities. And doing so hopefully will allow the business to benefit from doing this practice in the environment and ultimately make the business safer. So that's it for introductory conversation about vulnerability management and why it's important. Hopefully this is helping some of you on the call to answer some of these questions when other parts of the business start to ask about them. So we have some upcoming dates for the remaining episodes of this. And although this has been an overview of the topic, in the following webinar episodes, I wanted to dig in with more detail to some of the practices of vulnerability management, about how to integrate it into those other aspects, into what other parts of the business, what other processes can benefit from being integrated with vulnerability management, and how to include and collaborate with those other parts of the business, and thinking through how this process is changing over time and some things to think about for the future. So I want to take a second to thank Tenable for helping sponsor this series and to help support vulnerability management with organizations. So we do leverage Tenable as the underlying technology for our vulnerability management as a service practice. We also help organizations with implementing Tenable and integrating with some of our industry-leading security partners like ServiceNow and Palo Alto and Splunk and LogRhythm. And we also can provide risk advisory services to help organizations establish that practice in their environment, to assess that organizational posture and align those practices with an organization's strategic risk objectives. So at this point, I want to open up the conversation to questions. If anybody has any, please feel free to include them in the chat. And one thing that I would like to do following this is if there's thematic questions that we can cover, I definitely want to include this in the follow-through that we're going to have following this webinar. And what we can also do at this point, if it is challenging for people to type, is open up the audio in case there's anybody who has an audio question to ask. So audio is open. Okay. So first question that came up is how organizations with few internal resources move towards developing vulnerability management as a business process, which is a great question. So one of the the initial challenges here, especially looking historically at that manual intensive process on an Excel spreadsheet that can be difficult to manage and prioritize, is looking at how to align those processes with actual business units. And so part of that is a prioritization effort and ensuring that the information that you're providing is in that same format that the people who actually have to take that and execute on it are available. But in many circumstances, an organization doesn't have the resources to do this independently. And that's where getting third-party support to integrate those services with other aspects of your environment so that you're able to orchestrate or automate some of those responses over time can be very helpful. Because on one hand, having that rolling baseline of security vulnerabilities in your environment and prioritizing remediation is important. But the other aspect of this that's valuable is if there is an incident or if there's a security decision that needs to be made, that you have the vulnerability information to enrich that other decision that you need to make, that information is there as well. I have another question about the cloud AWS security aspect of vulnerability management, which is a good one. And looking at cloud assets and their relationship with vulnerability management is something we're going to definitely get into more detail on when we're talking about how the scope for vulnerability management is changing over time. But ultimately, as we're moving towards more of this shared responsibility model with some third-party providers, there is an interplay between understanding what assets that the organization is still responsible for and being able to ensure that they're protected, but also confirming that the configuration and use of those assets is done responsibly. And so being able to, first of all, being able to see those assets and understand how the business is using them, especially as we're moving towards that rapid prototyping DevOps model where assets may be ephemeral, that you have that visibility as quickly as possible and are able to demonstrate that the controls that you have to ensure that they're configured appropriately, that there haven't been vulnerabilities that have been introduced to those images that are being used for those instances are being addressed, not only when you're talking about assets that are in production, but also earlier in the process when they're being designed and prepared for that environment. Any other questions on the line or in the chat? Okay. Well, I certainly want to, again, take the time to thank you all for spending your afternoon with us to talk about this. And following this, if there are follow-through questions that are going to come from this or the following episodes, so if there's something in particular that you would like to address, getting in contact with your account executive or partners with Tenable would certainly be happy to help you with this. And with that, I want to offer you a bit of your time left today and say thank you, and I hope you're going to come back and attend our following episodes.